In this series, we will explain one of the best books that talked about habits, a really interesting book, and in this particular video we will find out why a person may reach the point where he loses his memory and does not forget how to speak, and the topic appears to be related to habits. My friend. The follower explains the first chapter of the book The Power of Habits by author Charles Dowie. Welcome, my friend. Let me give you my first impression of the book in this friendly way. The reason is that I expected that he would talk about customs, meaning in a very repetitive and well-known way. But what happened was exactly the opposite. I started reading the book, and from the first line, the writer pulled me to finish the first chapter, and I was astonished, very astonished, because the story he mentioned in the first chapter is not just an narration of events. The story is over. No, it was a shift in the history of studying human customs and memory. Every line he wrote in this story attracted me to the next line. The story, in short, revolves around the life of a person named Eugene Pauly. Of course, I read his name in Arabic and I do not know the correct English pronunciation. In general, his name is Eugene Pauly. The events of the story begin in the year 1993, when Eugene Pauly began to gradually lose his memory, and the reason behind this was an inflammatory disease. My brain is a virus that causes the destruction of some parts of Eugene Pauly's brain, and as a result, historical events begin that caused a great shift and progress in the study of human memory and behaviors. His memory, however, is in things that are impossible for him to forget, namely, for example, the manner of speaking, numbers at times, and he does not forget either. He must dress and not forget how to sleep and how to eat. For example, he knows that he must eat this thing with his hand. He will not forget it. Of course, you may imagine that the matter is not self-evident. He will not forget this thing. No, my observant friend, be careful. It is for you. Okay, may God keep you in good health. You will not be able to understand the complexity of matters. Here, I will give you an example. When a child is born, does he know how to walk? The answer is no, but he began to acquire this skill because he saw people around him walking upright on their feet, and also with practice and acquiring these skills. But when a person loses memory, it is obvious, it is very obvious that he forgets even how to move, but when you meet him, he does not forget his mother, he forgets his father, sometimes he forgets his name, he forgets his identity, but he still knows how to dress, how to walk, where to sleep, and even how to relieve himself. He knows that he must disappear from sight, my observing friend. These are very complicated matters, and their cause was completely unknown. Until we reached our friend Eugene Pauly, he allowed me to do so. I sighed because I really remembered the story. It was beautiful, and it affected me very much. To the point that it's a little gargling, a little cringe-eyed. No, frankly, the writer Charles knew how to write. I swear to God, he built the story. I'm sure I won't build it for you the same way he built it. And in the beauty of his writing, of course, the reason behind that is that I am trying to shorten the story, to give you all its important details, but I will not give you some of the details that he was explaining to Charles while he was talking about this story. For example, he was describing even the convulsions that it was coming accurately, of course, to save time in order to narrow the followers. I can give you this thing, so let us get into the important thing. We actually saved your time in a very surprising way while Eugene was having dinner with his wife Beverly. She said to him, "I wanted to tell you something. You see, your son Michael will visit us soon, God willing." He looked at it. He said, "Who is Michael?" and continued. She said, "No, your son Michael is visiting us soon." He looked at her with an expressionless face and said, "Who is Michael?" Within a few minutes of that moment, he began to adhere to his duties, and began to experience some convulsions, and within 24 hours they transferred Eugene to the hospital to find out he was infected with this viral encephalitis, and his brain was damaged in some areas due to this infection. My friend, Eugene entered a coma for 10 days, and he was on the verge of death, but after 10 days his condition stabilized and he began to improve and recover gradually. After approximately 2 weeks, Eugene returned as he was before, but with a missing memory. The writer tells you that the doctors told his wife Beverly, "Look, keep in mind that your husband will change. Take your mind off your old husband. You are now dealing with someone who may be completely new." What happened, old man, is that Dr. Squire, who is supervising Eugene's case, discovered that Eugene Paul has been losing his memory for the last 30 years and remembers everything before that. So it is not a total memory loss, but a partial one, and at the same time his memory cannot retain the information for more than a minute. Well, until now, everything is normal. There is nothing new. A person lost his memory, but something happened. Pay attention to Dr. Square, and this event that happened between Dr. Square and Eugene is what is considered the spark that started this new shift in the study of human memory and behaviors. One day, one of the laboratories decided that it was studying Eugene's case, so they made an appointment for him and his wife, Belf, before the world, which was supposed to be studying his case, came in. There was a nurse sitting at a computer. My observant friend, you are talking about approximately 1993. I mean, the computer was in its infancy, so it was a nurse is sitting at a desk typing on the computer. While what are you writing? Eugene smiled and pointed at the device on which she wrote, and said, "This thing is truly amazing. Focus with me. I want you to focus on this part. This thing is amazing. Indeed, when I was young, this thing was hanging on 2 stands 6 feet high, and it took up the entire space of this room." The nurse was continuing her work, and was typing on the computer. Eugene laughed again and said, "This thing is amazing. Actually, all these printed circuits, diodes, and triodes. When I was in the electronics business, there were a pair of 6-foot racks to go with them. This thing." My friend, the follower, focused on me. The scientist who was going to study Eugene's case entered and introduced himself to Eugene and asked him, "How old are you?" Eugene said, "Let me see, I think I am 59 or 60 years old," and his age at that real time was 70 years old. So the nurse got up and the scientist sat at this computer and began working on it. So Eugene smiled again and pointed to the computer, and he said, "This thing is really amazing. You know, when I was in electronics, there were a pair of stands that were 6 feet high, and this thing had the world attached to them. This is Dr. Larry Squire, Larry Squire." Notice how patient Eugene kept repeating the same sentence several times while he was working. My follower friend. This event, repeating the sentence that Eugene changed, is a historical shift and a cognitive leap in the science of human memory and behavior. I know, maybe then you don't understand and nothing. Almost what happened? This is my job. I am here to explain to you the world. Larry Squire took an X-ray of the brain of our friend Polly and discovered that the disease had affected the brain and destroyed some parts in an oval shape and in an area of the brain, the last part of the brain close to the spine, that it had not affected. This disease, Larry says, is that the shape of the patient Paul's brain reminds me of in the shape of an old sick brain. When I was in university we called him HN the sick. Originally, her name was Henry Mole, Jason. The scientist Larry says about this patient, whose name is HMO, or Henry, that he had the same condition that Eugene was living in. Today, after they performed a certain operation on her, he regained his memory and mentioned who his mother was and the area where he grew up, and his mother's upbringing, and so on, but he lost the new, recent memory. He only kept it for 20 seconds. I mean, let's say the same condition as Eugene, exactly, the difference between polio, the old patient HM had this condition due to the removal of part of the brain, but Polly or how can we get this thing without any surgical intervention? That's why they wanted to focus on his condition and actually study it, and in order to understand what happened to the patient, Eugene Polly was able to gain a new habit even though his brain cannot preserve recent memory for more than a minute. I mean, his mind now is not. He can retain any new information for more than a minute. He keeps it for a minute, after which he loses this information. Despite this, he has acquired a new habit. This speech is very dangerous. If you have not yet understood this example, God willing, it will make you understand one of the laboratories whose specialty is studying memory, brain formation, and behaviors. It was in a very cold operating room, its temperature reaching 60 degrees below zero. Imagine the number is terrifying. No human being can live, no creature can live there, but the purpose of this coldness is because the operations that are carried out in this room are to split a brain and implant some sensors in the brain of some mice in a gibbon varren. They implant sensors in their brains to monitor and study the state of brain activity, so they brought mice and implanted some sensors in them and began to perform a very strange experiment on them. They would bring one of these mice from Iran and put him in a maze in the shape of the letter T. The end of this maze is in my letter. The ends are a piece of chocolate, my observing friend. They would put the mouse at the beginning of the maze and put a barrier in front of the mouse. Then they would make a sound that reads something like this. For example, immediately after the click, they lower the barrier and begin studying the behavior of the mouse after they click and remove the barrier. Notice that as the mouse moves along, its brain is very active and effective, and it begins to move little by little. Alvaro studies everything around him, the edged wall, smells the smells present, and tries to move in a non-straight direction. He once studied this area. Then, once again, he studies the area. This sometimes comes back and sometimes comes forward, and in this case, the computer has a graph that shows the state of activity of the mouse's mind at this moment, so notice the mouse's mind. Active, very active, and he began to study everything in this maze in order to reach the end that was the piece of chocolate on the right side, and they also noticed that the mouse went to the other side and began to study everything until he ended up reaching the piece of chocolate. They settled on this experiment and began repeating it on a daily basis. They bring the same mouse and put it at the beginning of the maze, and in front of the barrier they give us the click, remove the barrier, and start studying the behavior of the mouse. The mouse's brain continued to be active for several times until it reached a stage after a while. As soon as it hears a click and goes to the barrier, the mouse moves very straight to reach the end of the available letter, after which it turns towards the piece of chocolate and takes it. There was a big change in the graphic form of the mouse's brain activity, and they noticed that it became active as soon as it heard a click, and then the activity of this brain decreased until it reached the piece of chocolate, or after that it became active again, and then it ended. The graph at the end of the experiment, of course, tells you what happened, my observing friend, and this is what is very strange. The mind of the living being collects some memories that are repetitive. It routinely or periodically stores them in a place in the brain called the basal ganglia, and this part of the brain is specialized in memories that they are considered or classified by the brain as habits. As soon as the brain realizes that the behavior you are performing is an existing habit that has memories stored in this part of the brain, it begins to reduce brain activity. It uses these existing memories, which are considered in the form of a habit or habits that follow a specific pattern and form. What does the word mean? This? I'm telling you, he says, remember when you first started driving? How was your mind? Working? With a very strong awareness that you are aware of every step, you take it while you move the car. From the moment you get in and lock the door, you are very aware of putting the key and turning the car clockwise, pull the belt, check the position of the mirrors, check the gas and the position of the steering wheel, gearbox, and you are completely aware of everything around you, so that when you start moving and want to get out of the parking lot and return the car to Laura, you are very focused on every step and every action you take. With time, my follower friend, you begin to get used to this thing and notice that after a period of time you do all these things unconsciously. And remember what I was saying to you in the previous video when we explained the subconscious mind. We said that 95% of your daily activity is done unconsciously. Exactly, this is the same thing. In fact, You start the car, ride, fasten a belt, adjust the mirrors, and walk. You do all of this unconsciously. Why? Because the brain classified these movements that you perform routinely as habits and began to reduce brain activity. As soon as it realizes that you got into the car, it tells you that habits are to be formed, and to hear dangerous words, they need evidence, a signal, meaning make it clear that this is the beginning of habitual behavior. For example, as soon as you get into the car and close the door, the view you see is the signal that the brain takes, and it knows that you are now using driving habits. So who is the signal? Brain activity is high, then it decreases completely and uses all the memory stored in the basal ganglia very regularly and unconsciously in order to relax the brain activity. Until the moment you decide to get into the car and get out, you close the door in order to give the reward, and he knows that you are out of context. This is a habit, and this is exactly what happened with Eugene. While the nurse and the scientist, Squire, was using the computer, Eugene told you that as soon as he listened to the keyboard clicks, he smiled and said the famous phrase that he used to say repeatedly, "This thing is amazing." Indeed, when you are miniaturizing or in the field of electronics, this thing was hanging on two stands that were 6-inch high feet, and whenever he heard the keyboard click, he repeated the same sentence, and that is what happened, my friend, the follower. His mind or the basal ganglia were not present in his brain, and were not damaged. They knew how to retain some new memories as habits, even though his mind could not retain the memory for a minute. His mind knew how to store the memory of habits, even though his memory could not retain the information for a minute, and this is the leap we are talking about, my friend. Follow up in the study of human memory and behavior. From this event, we learned how habits are preserved in our minds and brains. I tell you, when Eugene returned and lived his life at home, the same thing happened. He could not retain the new memory for a minute, and while he was living in his house, my observant friend, new habits were formed in Eugene despite the place. He lost his memory even though he was unable to retain the memory. For a minute, for example, his wife used to take him on a daily basis around a square in the neighborhood, and this was a type of psychological treatment for him based on when he was disturbed and sitting at home for a long time and started to have unnatural emotions, so the doctors would protect him, take him and let him go around the neighborhood one full circle or return home. She always used to dress him up in the morning and let him break his fast, and after that they would take him around the block. As soon as he returned, he would sit in the living room and watch TV on the History Channel. His wife, at the beginning of the days, was afraid. It was very difficult for him to stay on the road, so she made sure that she was with the first person they took the round to return home, and one day, as usual, something unusual happened. They were about to go out for the round, and perhaps our friend would come. Really opened the door, he left by himself without his wife with him. His wife. I noticed that they found what was there, so I quickly left the house and sat looking for him and knocking on the neighbors' doors and asking about him. Did you see him? Did you see him? What did you see from this talk? She was really terrified. Unfortunately, despite the search, she could not find him, so she decided to go home and inform the emergency department that her husband was really lost. As soon as she returned home, she found her husband sitting in the living room and opening the History Channel. She had some traces of plants on her hand, and this is evidence that they really took a turn around the neighborhood. He was feeling the plants in the neighborhood, and Eugene returned without his wife with him, and from here a habit was formed for Eugene even though his brain could not retain recent memory. And by the way, my observant friend, Eugene, he began to go out every day and make the same circle around the neighborhood without his wife would be with him, and you and Eugene formed many customs. She was very strange. He said that he was her daughter. She would always come and visit them daily. She would come in and greet him and say to him, "How are you, Dad? Who is talking about this?" Then she goes to her mother in the kitchen. Have a little chat with her. After that, she goes directly from the kitchen to the door and goes to finish her work. When Eugene heard her leaving the door, he became angry because she left without coming back and speaking to him. Imagine, my friend, who continues to repeat this thing. Let any guy get angry as soon as his daughter comes out the door for a few seconds. Then he comes back smiling as if something is normal and tells you that it is Eugene's mind. He kept these feelings as a habit, imagining that as soon as he heard the knock on the door facing his daughter, he would get angry. And the cases in which her daughter comes back and talks to him. Before you come out, break the pattern of the habit, meaning this anger would go away and they would not notice it. This emotion, my friend, follower of this talk, is very dangerous. It means that your brain can memorize even the feelings that appear in a certain pattern and at a certain frequency as a bad habit. For this reason, Charles says that when we start trying to acquire a new habit, we find it very difficult to acquire it. This means, for example, if you say that I will cut out sweets or go on a diet, it will be difficult for you to acquire this habit, and the reason is that you are accustomed to it once you feel hungry, you ask for a specific meal, or if you see a specific meal that you eat, or you are accustomed to, you cook this dish every day. Why? Because your mind keeps these behaviors as habits. As soon as you are hungry, you open the application and order. When you try to follow a specific or healthy diet, you find it difficult to acquire this matter at first, but after a period of time, as your mind retains this pattern as a habit, it begins to conform to it. It continues very smoothly, so I knew why we were there when we registered at the club. We cannot continue for a month because we are not accustomed to it, because our brain has not yet registered this behavior as a habit, but after a month, 2 or 3 months of commitment, this behavior begins to turn into a habit and the club becomes a lifestyle, and many habits are based on that, including smoking. Smoking for most people, what is usually an addiction? If he gets upset, he smokes. If he watches a game, he smokes. If he plays PlayStation, he smokes. If he sits with his 2 brothers, he smokes. The topic turns into behaviors, and by the way, there are many people who quit smoking if they cut themselves off from this environment. It is their friends who smoke, and as soon as he returns to sit with them, the habit begins to return to him, and he may go back to smoking, and the reason behind that is his friends who used to smoke with them. But it may push his brain towards smoking, at least once. This dangerous and powerful information is enough to give you the key through which you can form any habit that is new to you. Charles says at the end of the first chapter that habits must have a precise, arranged pattern, and if this pattern is disturbed, a habit is disturbed. Because of this, Eugene, sometimes when his daughter would come back to him and talk to him before she went out, the feeling of anger that he used to repeat over and over again would come to him. He even tells you that fast food restaurants know that the pattern of custom is supposed to be the same without changing, and that is why the restaurants make sure that their decor is the same in all their branches. By God Almighty, this information is dangerous, my friend. Followers try to maintain the decoration of all branches to ensure that as soon as your mind senses the presence of this branch in this way, he goes to the restaurant and orders a meal, and they say that it is the first restaurant chain to implement this. McDonald's was, as you know, a criminal, and in fact, most of the McDonald's restaurants have the same decor to a very large extent. Because your mind doesn't see the decor. This is considered the motivator, and he begins to use the stored memories as habits and goes downstairs and goes to the restaurant and orders or stops at and orders a quick meal and walks. This talk is very dangerous. Therefore, we want to conclude from all of this that habits are formed. The farm theory requires that you repeat this topic and stick to it. But what is very important is that you put an alarm or a signal to start the habit, and a reward like the piece of chocolate that the mouse used to get at the end of the session. So it sometimes tells you if you want to record a good habit, for example, like going to the club or reading books, whatever it is, giving yourself an incentive and a reward that says, for example, that as soon as I break my fast and drink a cup of coffee, exactly 2 hours later, I must go to the club. Whatever the cost, this is the motivation that you must do on a daily basis. Breakfast, a cup of coffee, 2 hours, I am in the club, and immediately after you get rid of the club, reward yourself with something that you like, something that you really like, even if it is a piece of chocolate or sweets or whatever, and try to use a non-harmful reward, i.e. playing PlayStation, check out with friends who listen to a song you like, and keep repeating this thing until you form this habit after a long period of time. You see, it may reach only a month, and there are many books or many studies that prove that it is 21 days, cysts re. The second point that we want to know in this video is that the habit is very precise. If its shape is distorted, your brain will not understand that you are practicing this habit. For example, if you want to quit a bad habit, see what is the stimulus at the beginning, which makes your mind understand that the habit will start. Now, cutting off this motivating stimulus may be a break. You go to it every day, or a place, or a cafe. You sit there every day, or a position in the house, or a place in the house like an annex, etc., or a session with friends, or a game you play, whatever it is. Try. As much as possible, you cut off this stimulus. Or do you not practice this bad habit? If you get the motivation, after a period of time this habit will begin to distort, and your mind will understand, my friend, what follows is that this stimulus no longer means doing this behavior anymore, and thus, after a period of time, you get rid of this bad habit. This talk is dangerous, and very useful. How can it be? The first chapter has ended in the next episode. We will talk about the second chapter, and I think that the topic will be rich, and it contains marketing, and this is what I like most about it. So if you liked the first chapter, my follower friend, share it with those you love. WhatsApp, Snapchat, Instagram, etc.